Welcome to the 12th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival. We are at Darbar Hall. The Templars, the rise and spectacular fall of God's holy warriors. Let us welcome our speakers for the day, Dan Jones, introduced by Christopher D. Hamel. Please give a huge round of applause for them.
Ladies and gentlemen, for many of us, history was a rather dull subject at school. And it is extremely pleasing for those of us who are historians to see what a large number of events at this festival are to do with history. And I suspect that is the influence of William Dalrymple. And it is a particular pleasure for me to be able to present to you one of the great phenomena of modern history studies in Britain. It's hardly possible now in England to open a newspaper or to turn on the television without seeing Dan Jones there. A week ago in the Evening Standard, where he runs has a column, he was asking whether politicians can learn from historians. There's a question you can ask him later. He has done a multiple series of television programs bringing history to an enormous audiences of people, bigger even than Jaipur. He's done them on the Plantagenets and on things like castles and canals of Great Britain. And he has written books which have been a phenomenal success, including the one about which he's speaking on the Templars, but he's also written on the Plantagenets and Magna Carta and the Tudors and many subjects which have caught the public imagination. And in the introduction to this book, he emphasizes that what he's aiming for is readability, and that ability to convey history vividly, so that it's not a dull subject, but is actually fun to read and interesting and enjoyable, is tremendously important to those of us who beaver away in archives. He is going to be speaking, I will have no part in it, speaking himself about his book on the Templars. He'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions. He will tell you about the subject. It's not for me to do so. But here is a field that introduces everything that people think the Middle Ages are all about. Knights in armor, damsels in distress, money, aristocracy, love affairs, and ultimately betrayal, betrayal, deceit, and murder, on which theme I am delighted to hand you over to Dan Jones.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for that extremely kind introduction. The introduction is always my favourite part of the talk, because there's nothing I like better than hearing all my achievements enumerated, and particularly by someone as learned as Christopher Hamel. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming inside on a beautiful sunny day. It's really, really lovely to be here in India talking about the Templars, about my book about the Templars. I wrote this book in 2016, it came out the autumn of 2017, and since then I feel like I have been talking about it for about 18 months. And what you notice when you start talking about the Templars is that slightly weird things start to happen. The Templars have a slightly odd effect on people's brains and on their moods. And I remember being in Los Angeles giving a talk much like this, although far fewer people. It was in a little bookshop in West Hollywood. And as I was talking about the Templars, I could see a couple sitting near the back who were really, really, really enthusiastic. And that's great, a history lecture where people are really enthusiastic. We like that. But really enthusiastic. And it came to a book signing afterwards, and I'm sort of signing away, and I could see this very nice couple in the queue, but instead of books, they had like a box, like a wooden box about that big. And as they were coming closer and closer in the queue, I was thinking to myself, I was thinking about the movie Seven. Has anyone even seen the movie Seven with Brad Pitt? Okay, for those of you who haven't seen the movie Seven, then, you don't want to know what's in the box at the end. Anyway, as they were coming closer and closer, I kept thinking to myself, do not mention the movie 7, do not mention the movie 7. As they arrived, I said, what's in the box? Gwyneth Paltrow's head. Oh. For those of you who haven't seen the movie 7, it's now completely ruined. It wasn't Gwyneth Paltrow's head, it was in fact the Holy Grail, literally the Holy Grail. Well, actually 2 Holy Grails, both with a little Monty Python logo on them, which they wanted to, which is it's kind of sweet. But so that's the sort of nice side, I guess the normal side of Templar weirdness. The other day I had a good email which I want to share to you from someone I've never met in my life before. And this is totally apropos of nothing. Hi, Dan Jones, it begins. I wonder if you know of a dark-skinned Arab-robed knight carrying a curved cutlass bejeweled with gold and silver handle. The Knights Templar called him the Black Lord, and he helped them leave Solomon's temple. Please, if you know anything, I would love to be enlightened. Thank you. And I left this for a while because I thought, just don't get involved, don't get involved. And then I couldn't resist. And so I replied, do you have a source for this? And immediately came back, yes. Right, what is it? Myself. I was there, not in a dream. Something happened, then I was transported and I was digging underground with those around me dressed differently to me. I looked down and my skin was black, dressed in black robes. Then I was out of that, straight into the hull of a galleon-type wooden ship, sitting on a turned-up casket. I felt and looked down at my sword-type cutlass hanging at my side, as I've described. Other men sitting and laying on the floor were wearing Knights Templar tunics, brackets Red Cross. That at least was accurate. I asked one of the men near me, who am I? And he said, astonished, you're the Black Lord. Then I was back sitting on my sofa at home. I don't know what to say to that. I really don't. Except that the Templars have this weird effect on people that, you know, when I was writing about Magna Carta, I certainly didn't get correspondence of that type. People ask me when I started writing the book, why write about the Templars? And that's a very good and reasonable question. And the honest and most immediate answer is, have you not seen how much the Da Vinci Code sold? Because Dan Brown's bank balance must be. The real answer goes back, I suppose, to my childhood in a way. And my dad was a very big fan of ghost stories. And he particularly liked the ghost stories of a Cambridge scholar called M.R. James, Montague Rhodes James. Anyone read the ghost stories or seen the television adaptation of M.R. James's ghost stories? Well, there's one that my dad particularly liked, and it was called Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. And this was adapted by the BBC into a spooky, ghostly Christmas story. And it pertains to the Templars this way. The story, in brief, is of a Don from Cambridge, I think, who goes on a golfing holiday. And before he goes on his golfing holiday, another fellow of the college at high table asks him, you're going to such and such a village, I think in East Anglia, would you do me a favor? There's a Knights Templar preceptory, you know, a sort of monastery-style house of the Knights Templar. The ruins of it are in this village. While you're there, this is before Google Maps and all that, while you're there, would you take some measurements of the preceptory and just bring them back to me and make some observations? He said, yeah, of course, between golf games, that's going to be no problem. Long story short, he goes to the village, he plays a bit of golf, he finds the Knights Templar preceptory, he takes some measurements, but as he's rooting around in the ground, he finds a whistle with a weird inscription on it. And he blows the whistle, and nothing happens. Until later, spooky things start to occur. He feels this ghostly presence in his room as he's sleeping. He sees weird people at the windows of the hotel. Eventually, he sort of wakes up in this terrible sort of fright in the night, and things are trying to get into his room and get him. And I think the end of the story is just his bedclothes get a bit tangled up or something. It's sort of, there's a bit of pathos in the end of the story. But the point of that ghost story that always stuck with me was this. M.R. James was a great medievalist, a great scholar of the Middle Ages. He knew more about the Middle Ages probably than almost anyone living in his time. And when he wrote this ghost story about weird happenings and spooky goings on, he could have chosen for the inciting incident, could he not, anything from the Middle Ages. You know, it could have been a Cistercian house, a Benedictine house, a castle, a cathedral, a nunnery. a hospitaller priory, but it wasn't any of those things. The source of deep weirdness for M.R. James writing that story was the Templars. And it made me think that the Templars have somehow leapt out of their real history and found their way into the popular consciousness, into popular culture. And it's not, because of course it's not just M.R. James, it's not just Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code. It's not just Ivanhoe, in which one of the baddies, Sir Brian de Bois-Guilbert, is a Templar knight. It goes all the way back to the time that the Templars themselves were active in the 1190s, the turn of the 13th century, when Jerusalem, the kingdom of Jerusalem, the great Crusader state was falling, when in Germany Wolfram von Eschenbach was writing Holy Grail romances and was placing Templar-like knights in them then. So almost for 700-800 years, the Templars have occupied this weird space between the facts, the reality, the history, and our popular consciousness, storytelling, myth, and legend. And for me, that was an incredibly potent thing to address in a book. But it also makes us ask the question, why? Why the Templars? Why have they done this to us? How have they burst the banks of history and entered a larger mythological, legendary space? And that's something I want to come back to in a little while, because I think in order to answer that question, we should really talk about what is the history of the Knights Templar, who were they, where did they come from, what did they do? Now, when we're thinking about who the Knights Templar were and what they did, the place we have to start is quite specific. We have to go to Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, in the aftermath of the First Crusade, the beginning of the 12th century, 1101, 1102, after Jerusalem had fallen to this enormous armies of Christians from France and Italy and England and Flanders who'd traveled hundreds, thousands of miles across land and conquered cities in Syria and Palestine, and eventually in July 1099 taken Jerusalem itself and established Crusader states, 4 of them, all centered around the kingdom of Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ's empty tomb was enshrined. Now, at the beginning of the 12th century, the kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled by Latin kings, Frankish kings, kings of the West, was experiencing a security crisis. These were newly set up, very fragile states in hostile territory, ruled over, as I say, by Latin kings and a small group of colonists. And in the early decades of the 12th century, there was a crisis of security. And we know about this because we have the accounts of pilgrims who went to visit the Crusader states and to pray at Christ's tomb. We have Christian pilgrims who came from the West to Jerusalem who kept diaries, one of which is kept in the library, I think, of Corpus Christi. And that diary, which I begin the story of the Templars with, is by a pilgrim, probably a British pilgrim, called Ceolwulf. He describes his incredibly difficult journey to the kingdom of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, and all the dangers that were attendant on that journey. Now, the dangers of the journey were part of the point. It was a pilgrimage. It was supposed to be difficult and penitential. It was part of the point. Nevertheless, when you read Ceolwulf's diary, you are absolutely hit square in the face by what a dangerous place this was. Ceolwulf says he alighted at the port of Jaffa, now part of the city of Tel Aviv, and traveled overland to Jerusalem through the Judean hills. He says, as you went overland, you see the bodies of pilgrims just like yourself, lying by the roadside, where they've been robbed and murdered and just left unburied. He says, your urge, your instinct, as a pilgrim and as a Christian yourself, is to stop and give a decent burial to these people who've been killed and left dead. He says, but you can't, because anyone who stopped to do that would have to dig a grave for himself. So dangerous were the Crusader states for pilgrims. And this is in the context of repeated attacks on Christian pilgrims going overland between Jaffa and Jerusalem, traveling around Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the rest of the Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. So in 1119, 20 years after the establishment of the kingdom of Jerusalem, so the story goes, a French knight called Hugh de Pin and several of his colleagues, somewhere between 9 and 30 of them, the accounts vary, got together at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and decided that they as pilgrims, but also as warriors, were going to unite those two aspects of themselves and create a body of knights who would devote their lives to living a sparse and penitential existence, reliant on charity, on handouts. They would be doing the service of the Lord by protecting pilgrims on the roads around Jerusalem. And that this would be their mission for the rest of their lives. They would take vows of poverty, of chastity, and of obedience. They would live monastic-style lives, originally in obedience to the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. And they would devote themselves to providing a sort of pilgrim bodyguard service, a kind of roadside rescue, a AAA or an RAC or whatever the equivalent is, that if you got into trouble while you were traveling around the holy sites, the Templars would be there to bodyguard you, to protect you. And this was to be their mission. Now, this was quite a disruptive idea. And we're used in present-day society to small groups of people having disruptive ideas. It happens all the time in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. This is the equivalent at the beginning of the 12th century. Because their idea, infusing a monastic-style life with monastic-style oaths of poverty, chastity, and obedience, with a job that when you unpacked it and drilled down was about killing people, defending Christian pilgrims meant killing brigands or chasing them away on horseback at the end of a lance or a sword. This was quite a radical thing to do because in creating this organization, what Hugh de Payne was proposing was to fuse the role of the knight and the monk. In medieval society, these were very distinct ideas, they were very distinct ways of life. Those who prayed and those who fought were not really supposed to, their lives were not supposed to overlap or collide. But what Hugh de Payne was proposing was to bind them into a single order of knighthood, much like, he was heavily influenced by the order of the Cistercians, much like a monastic order, except your job would be not praying but fighting. Now, there were other people with similar ideas in Jerusalem at the time. At the hospital of St. John, just across the road from the Holy Sepulchre, there were people who were devoting their lives, living under a sort of monastic-style rule, and devoting themselves to caring for pilgrims, providing hospital services. Well, they would evolve into the Hospitallers and would eventually also have a military function. But Hugh de Payne's group were specifically about providing armed assistance for pilgrims. He gained support very quickly, and here the analogy of the disruptive idea today sort of follows through, because if you have a disruptive idea in Silicon Valley today, what's the first thing you go and do? You go and find someone else's money to spend. And that's exactly what Hugh de Payne and his companions did, and they were excellent at it. They spent the 1120s raising political support and money for this new organization. The first person they went to was Baldwin II, the Latin king of Jerusalem. And Baldwin II rather liked the idea of having a sort of private bodyguard service for pilgrims visiting his kingdom. He granted them royal approval, and he gave them apartments in which to reside, to have their headquarters. These were on what we call the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, in what had been, until the fall of Jerusalem to the first Crusaders, Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the Templars set up their headquarters there. Now, they identified this spot with the Temple of Solomon, so described, the building of which is described in the Book of Kings. And from that they became known as the poor knights, given their vow of poverty, of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, or for short, the Templars. They also went back to Europe and started raising money and political support there. They went round the great and the good, the kings, the nobles, the high churchmen of Europe, of Western Christendom, of Latin Christendom, and asked for support, asked for donations, asked for the backing of the great and the good of the time. And they were very successful in doing that as well. Their key patron in Western Christendom was the great Cistercian letter writer and political advocate Bernard of Clairvaux, later Saint Bernard, who helped in 1129 to write a rule by which the Templars could live. So by 1129, not only did they have the support of the King of Jerusalem and of St. Bernard, probably the great sort of political advocate and monastic thinker of the time, they'd also gained the support of the papacy. They'd been granted tax breaks and financial privileges in order to help fund the order. They had amassed supporters in England, in France, particularly around the region of Champagne. They recruited more men to come to the east and join their movement. They were a fully fledged organization with a name. They had an identity. They were moving towards a position which, another 10 years later, they would have what we now call a brand identity, this idea of the red cross emblazoned on black or white robes. This was now a fully functioning, fully realized organization, and a military order, an order of knighthood devoted to defending pilgrims in the Holy Land. And that really is the first phase of Templar history. It leads fairly directly to a second phase, which is the Templars not just as pilgrim bodyguards, but as warriors, as elite warriors, as soldiers, as a sort of medieval SAS or Navy SEALs or French Foreign Legion. From about the middle of the 12th century, we see the Templars experiencing what we now call mission creep. They've started as an organization to protect pilgrims, and very quickly that rolls into a purpose of defending not just pilgrims to Jerusalem, but the city of Jerusalem itself. They're manning watchtowers by the roads. They're providing military defense for the city. Fairly soon, by the time of the Second Crusade in the 1140s, we see Templars fighting in Crusade armies. When Louis VII, King of France, follows in the footsteps of the first Crusaders across Europe, across Asia Minor, down through the mountains into Syria, and so he was intending on to Jerusalem, we see 50 Templar knights riding with him all the way from Paris. And when Louis's crusade gets into trouble, trying to cross a dangerous mountain range in Anatolia, in Asia Minor, it's the Templars who ride to the rescue, who take over command of the whole crusading army, who give them basic training in how to withstand attacks from the Turks of the region who are trying to destroy the army. From the 1160s onwards, we see the Templar rule, which originally was modeled as on a monastic rule, become a military handbook for elite special forces. It is absolutely full of provisions of how to fight, how Templars should ride, what the rules are about raising their battle standard of the piebald banner of black and white in the field, how they should never leave the field until they're either carried off dead or the black and white piebald standard has fallen. We see rules about how they should ride, how they should speak, how they should operate, when they're out on patrol. They become a fully fledged elite military organization. When the Kingdom of Jerusalem is at war with Saladin during the 1180s, the great Ayyubid Sultan of Syria and Egypt, the Templars become a more and more central part of Crusader armies. They are the heavy cavalry. When Richard the Lionheart, Richard I, King of England, comes on the Third Crusade, he brings with him new recruits for the Templars who've been butchered by Saladin in the aftermath of the Battle of Hattin in 1187. More than 200 members of the military order beheaded, specifically because Saladin recognizes they are the fiercest fighters of all the Franks, as one of his close associates writes. We see the Templars riding rearguard with Richard the Lionheart's armies. They are the last line of defense of those armies. And by the time we get into the 13th century, the Templars have moved so far away from their original duty of protecting pilgrims that they are now manning castles at the most vulnerable and strategically important points all through the Crusader states. Not just Jerusalem is lost in 1187, but they're still manning castles on the approach from Egypt up into Syria and Palestine. They're manning castles in the Principality of Antioch, protecting the passes down into Syria from Asia Minor. If you go to the second great crusading arena of Spain and Portugal, you see Templars manning castles there. Templars have really become absolutely integral to the military defense of the Crusader states. They are elite special forces. And so that's really the second phase of Templar history. Now, the third phase, as I describe it in the book, is another stage of, if you like, mission creep, another extension of the function of this organization. Now, you'll often hear it said that the Templars were the world's first bankers, or global bankers, or whatever. And I have some issues when I hear people say that, because I don't think it actually goes far enough. What you see with the Templars, particularly in the 13th century, is their expansion from a military organization into an organization with so many different functions in property ownership, in agricultural estate management, in money lending, in money transportation, in shipping. They become a global, well, not a global, but they become what we now call an international business with interests from Ireland all the way through to Syria. And the reason this happens is quite straightforward. It's because in order to run a military organization like the Templars, you need quite a lot of money and you need a regular source of income. The Templars survived, given their original oath of poverty, on donations. And that wasn't just handouts of clothes or armor or weapons or money or food. It also became gifts of property, gifts of land. And throughout Europe, throughout Western Europe, France, England, a little bit in Germany, a little bit in Italy, a lot in Spain, you see pious, wealthy people and pious, not so wealthy people giving big gifts to the Templars. Now, there are several reasons why you might want to do this. One might be you're joining the Templars and you want to bring with you some property for the organization. Another might be you want to buy into the crusading movement without actually having to go to the trouble of going to fight or without being able to go and fight in the Holy Land or in Spain yourself. But the net effect of all of these enormous gifts of land and of property is that the Templars, by the middle of the 13th century, have a huge property portfolio in Europe, and they're experts at managing that portfolio of financial and property interests in order to funnel money through to the arenas of crusading warfare, through to the East or through to Spain and Portugal. They gain, as an organization, incredible institutional understanding of what we now call high finance. And that means that they become very useful to non-Templar politicians and organizations. So some examples. When King John in England was facing a massive rebellion of his barons in 1214 to 1215, which eventually threw up the document we now know as Magna Carta, it was to the Templars that he went when he lost London and lost the Tower of London and lost access to his treasure house, effectively. He went to the Templars just outside the old city walls in order for them to keep him safe and keep his possessions, his treasure, his wealth safe. We see, if you look at Magna Carta, the master of the Templars in England named as a witness right between the bishops and the barons. In France, throughout the 13th century, the Templars subcontracted huge swathes of government business. They were responsible in parts of France for paying public officials on behalf of the crown. They were running a lot of the accounting functions, basically treasury functions of the French crown from the temple in Paris. They were dealing with accounts for not only the King of France, but a lot of his relatives. When Louis IX, the sainted King of France, went on crusade down to Egypt in the middle of the 13th century and got himself captured, and the Crusaders in Egypt came up short of money for his ransom, it was the Templars who provided the last installment of his ransom, £30,000 of silver by weight, which they had sitting in a galley in the Nile Delta. They were an incredibly wealthy organization. They had the capacity, they're often described as a sort of a money transfer system, but they had the capacity to transfer wealth as if by what we now call wire transfer from one part of Europe to the other. You could go to the Templars in London and effectively mortgage some property to them and take with you a chit of receipt, effectively, to another Templar house. It could be in Paris, it could be in Italy, it could be in the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, and redeem the value of what you'd given to the order in another part of Christendom. This was an incredibly sophisticated organization, so sophisticated that at the time of the Fifth Crusade, in the 12-teens to early 1220s, Pope Honorius III called upon the Templars, used the Templars to collect the papal tax that raised money for the crusade. Now that might sound incredibly dry and boring until you think about what that means. Here is an organization that's capable of levying a pan-European tax, not just in a single country or a single area, but going throughout Ireland, England, Scotland, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy. Knock, knock, who's there? It's the Templars, hand it over. There's a crusade going on. And then taking that wealth all the way to the Nile Delta, where the crusade was being fought. That's an incredibly sophisticated organization. And what we see by the end of the 13th century is the Templars, with a hand, as I've said, not only in military matters, but in money lending, in money transfer, in property ownership, residential and commercial, in agricultural estate management, in advisory functions to national, quote-unquote, national treasuries. Incredibly sophisticated. They're not just the first bankers, they're the world's first sort of financial services organization as well. So that's the third phase of Templar history. And the last phase, which I described in the book, is probably the one that gets us closer to the question I posed at the beginning, which is why have the Templars burst the banks of history and entered our popular consciousness? Because a lot of what I've just described about the Templars could also be said of other organizations in the Middle Ages. They were not the only military order. There were the Hospitallers, who became their great rivals in the Crusader states, who performed a very similar function and could also go and collect papal taxes if you wanted them to. There was a German military order set up under the auspices of the Holy Roman Empire called the Teutonic Knights, who eventually went off and set up effectively a military state of their own in Prussia. In Spain, there were various small military orders specifically devoted to the Reconquista. There was the Order of St. Lazarus. There were military orders all over the place, but it's the Templars that we still talk about now. And probably the biggest reason for that is the nature of the Templars' fall. At the beginning of the 14th century, when the order was persecuted, wound up, destroyed, not only as an organization, but reputationally, on the say-so of Philip IV, the Capetian King of France. Now, we could talk about that, the story of the dissolution of the Templars for 2 hours, but I see the clock says we have 28 minutes and 40 seconds. I won't even take all of that time. Here, though, is a potted history of the fall of the Templars. In 1291, the Crusader states were destroyed by the Mamluks, an organization of, a state of Egypt and Syria united under a caste of slave soldiers. The Mamluks swept up from Egypt into Syria and bit by bit throughout the mid-decades of the 13th century, crushed the Crusader states and swept them into the sea. The last stand occurred in the city of Acre or Acca in May 1291. And in fact, the very last stand occurred at the house of the Templars in the city of Acre or Acca, where there's a sort of siege of Saigon, a fall of Saigon-style siege, as people are fleeing onto boats from the Templar house, trying to get out of the last remaining stronghold in the Crusader states. After the fall of the Crusader states, when everyone retreated to Cyprus and there were no longer any Latin states on the Syrian or Palestinian mainland, the Templars had a problem because they had effectively ceased to have a function. It was all very well having these kind of financial capabilities and a great military capability, but what if there is no Jerusalem to defend? What if there is no kingdom of Jerusalem to defend? And they became all of a sudden very vulnerable to criticism. Vulnerable to the criticism of not having a purpose, vulnerable to the criticism of having lost the Crusader states on their watch. They had to justify their purpose seriously for really the first time since their inception. Cut to France at the same time. You have a king of France, Philip IV, cold, extremely pious, extremely cynical, callous, and, as it would turn out, very cruel, paranoid, and dangerous. Philip IV of France had a lot of problems, particularly financial problems. A lot of them stemming from his wars on 3 fronts. Wars with Flanders, war with England, war with Aragon, which had drained the French treasury. There were other problems with the French finances as well. There was a lack of silver in Europe at the time. There had been catastrophic devaluations of the French coinage and even more catastrophic attempts to revalue the French coinage. There were a lot of problems. These were allied to Philip's particular view of the French monarchy as unique, sacral, and a rival to the papacy in the leadership of Western Christendom. Now, Philip IV, in order to pursue both of those agendas, one of raising money and two of proving who was the most godly king and ruler in Europe, had gone after several groups within his kingdom before he got to the Templars. In the very early years of the 14th century, he tried to tax the French church quite heavily, and that took him into direct conflict with the papacy, who thought it was the right of Rome to do such a thing or to permit such a thing. This long-running argument became a long-running battle, became, in 1303, a French army going down to the Pope's villa at Agnani, surrounding it, and roughing up the Pope of the time, Boniface VIII, to the extent that a matter of weeks after William de Nogaret, one of Philip IV's key ministers, had gone down there with his henchmen, Pope Boniface VIII died stark raving mad in his bed. Now there's a lovely little miniature, not lovely if you're Boniface I suppose, of the Pope lying in his bed with little gouts of blood spurting out of his wrists, because for a long time the story was that Boniface had gone so mad he'd chewed his own hands off in his death throes, which seems improbable until you ate, if any of you have ever eaten a plate of chicken wings, it is sort of, you can do it. As it turned out, it looks like he didn't chew his hands off. When his skeleton was exhumed, I think in the 17th century, the hands were seen to be intact. So I can set your mind at rest on that score. However, Boniface VIII was a casualty of the long-running row between Rome and Paris over the matter of taxation and of the matter of Philip's wish to be the sort of leader of Christendom. Attacking the church in France did not do the job that Philip wanted. So in 1306, he moved on to another perceived wealthy group in the French kingdom and tried to extort as much money as he could out of them. They were the Jews of France. This is a period during the Crusades of rampant and almost rabid anti-Semitism in Europe. And many kingdoms, including England, had expelled all the Jews from their kingdom, partly so that their wealth, often raised through involvement in money lending, could be extorted, and also to satisfy the sort of the prejudice of the mob. In 1306, Philip IV of France pursued this same policy. He sent out secret orders to his royal officials all around France and said, 1 month from the receipt of these orders, you will round up every Jew who lives within your jurisdiction. You'll throw them in jail, take their property, and hand it over to the French crown. I'm simplifying the process somewhat, but that is effectively what happened. A month later, all the Jews in France, accounts say 100,000, it may have been fewer than that, but it was a substantial number of people, were rounded up, arrested, expelled with nothing other than the clothes they stood up in, effectively, and their wealth was appropriated by the French crown. Unfortunately for everybody, this still didn't solve Philip's financial problems. It did give him a certain cachet of having bolstered his reputation as being a sort of muscular, bigoted Christian. It did very little other than that. And so a year later, almost to the day, in the middle of September 1307, Philip's ministers set into process exactly the same attack on the Order of the Temple. Now, the Order of the Temple, in France particularly, was seen to be very rich. It was very rich. It owned all this enormous property we've already talked about. Because it had been subcontracting French treasury functions, there was an enormous amount of wealth held in Paris. Philip himself knew exactly how wealthy the Templars of Paris were, because during riots on the streets of Paris in 1306 over his own financial policies, he'd gone to the temple in Paris to seek protection. He knew just how wealthy this organization was. During the year leading up to the autumn of 1307, his ministers, led by William de Nogaret, had started compiling a dossier of supposed crimes of the French Templars. And in September 1307, they sent, once again, orders were sent to royal officials in the localities saying, in 1 month from the receipt of this letter, you will go to every Templar house under your jurisdiction, arrest the members there, confiscate the wealth, bring it under the supervision of the French crown, and we shall take it from there. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, that is exactly what happened. French officials went to the Templar houses all across France, which, this being France and not Spain, Portugal, or Cyprus, were not military institutions, but looked much more like monasteries, staffed by, in general, rather more elderly Templars than would have been fighting on the military front. They presented them with a litany of supposed crimes of the organization, which had been designed, sexed up, as the saying goes, literally in some cases, to shock and appall. The list of accusations against the Templars was almost designed to press every button in the right-thinking Christian's kind of Daily Mail reader mindset that you could have had at this time. It was accusing the Templars of having secrets, strange induction ceremonies in which they forced each other to deny Christ, to kiss one another on various parts of the male anatomy, to urinate on the cross, to urinate and spit and stamp on images of Christ. They were accused of having forced one another to have sexual relations with one another. Everything that was disgusting and perverted and controversial was chucked into this dossier, built on the evidence of a few renegade ex-Templars, and a lot of speculation and in many cases total fabrication. This was presented at all these Templar houses. They were arrested, thrown into jail, their property was sequestered by the French crown. And from that point onwards, the order was effectively doomed. Because at this time there was a French Pope, Clement V, who was effectively an appointee of Philip IV, who pressurized the College of Cardinals into appointing him. With the complicity of the papacy, the Order of the Temple was wound up over a period of years. Now, what wound up meant was putting individual brothers on trial through interrogations and severe torture in which their hands were pinned behind their back and raised up via strappado until blood flowed from under their fingernails. They were beaten. They were what we'd now call psychologically mistreated. They were questioned over and over and over again. Did you urinate on the image of Christ? Did you spit on Christ? Did you deny Christ? The records of the trials of the Templars are very, very specific, explicit and clear that admissions to these accusations were tortured out of them. And eventually, by the process of torturing Templars, bringing them out in public show trials and forcing them to admit to these supposed errors, a huge wealth of documentation was amassed, which appeared to show that the Order of the Temple itself and its members were hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly blasphemous. This process under the say-so of the Pope was repeated in countries across Western Christendom, despite the quizzical reaction of many of the kings of Christendom to it. And so, to cut a long story short, by the time 1312 came around, the Council of Vienne in 1312 convened to decide the matter of the Templars with a French army camped about 15 miles down the road. Lo and behold, it came to the conclusion that the Order of the Temple had not only failed in its original mission, but was corrupted, defiled beyond salvation. And it was the best thing for it was that it should be rolled up, its property should be taken into papal hands, and no one should presume or dare ever to join the Order of the Temple ever again. 2 years later, the last master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, and several of his colleagues were brought out to be sentenced to life imprisonment, this on top of 5 years of imprisonment already and much torture. Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny, one of the senior members of the Order of the Temple, effectively lost their cool, lost their minds at this final sentencing, recanted admissions that they'd made to all of these supposed crimes, and were burned at the stake summarily in the middle of Paris as heretics. So by 1314, the last master of the temple was burned to death, supposedly cursing Clement V, the Pope, and Philip IV as he burned. The Order of the Temple had been dissolved. It was no more. And that really is the end of the Templar story, except to say that it's not. Because of course, as I said at the beginning, the Templars, although they did not survive as an institution, they've been revived by various people since, but they did not survive as the institution they were at the height of the Crusades. That was rolled up and their property was taken away. But what has survived is the image of the Templar, is the idea of the Templar, and is the place of the Templar in the popular mindset. Now, as I said, I think the fall of the Templars, the trial of the Templars, the lascivious, lewd accusations made against them are a massive part of why the order has remained so exciting to people, so intriguing to people. The mystery of what happened to the wealth of the Templars, which, by the way, probably went straight into the French treasury, has lured people into thinking it was buried in an island off Canada or whatever for many, many years. So there are all sorts of obvious reasons why the Templars should still occupy this place in our minds. But I think having spoken about their history at large, I think there are other reasons why this story still matters to us. Because it's a story that is about the Western projection of power into the Middle East, and the involvement then in states, powerful, wealthy states of the West, in the Middle East, in places like Syria and Palestine and North Africa, in wars that cannot be won, that drain endless amounts of money and lives. They can't be won, they can't be retreated from without terrible political fallout. It's a mess in the Middle East. I mean, I think that's something that still speaks to us today. This is also a story about people who join an organization, not just to fight in a war that's about geography and territory, that's to fight in a war that is, in some sense, spiritual, that is a battle of the soul. Because to join the Templars was, in some ways, to seek martyrdom. The point of joining this elite, holy, special force in which you took monastic vows as well as deploying military training was that you could die in the service of Christ. And I think if we look at organizations like ISIS and what's been going on in Syria and Libya and elsewhere in recent years, we see exactly the same mindset amongst young men who want to go and die for their faith. It might be a different faith, but it's the same idea. It's also, as I said slightly jokingly, a story about a small group of people with a radical, disruptive idea who take that idea, raise an enormous amount of finance and funding for it, and then suddenly have an international organization that's gone into areas they could never have foreseen, where they're colliding with the political agendas of realms, of kings, of governments of the day. The Facebook story is not so different from the story of the Templars. They've both got excellent branding, if nothing else. But more that it's a story about high finance, it's a story about the webs of money and of trade and of commerce that go across borders. It's all of these things that still speak to us in some sense today. But more than any of that, I think when we look at the fall of the Templars, what we see is the story of what happens when a somewhat deranged leader decides to use lying repeatedly, grotesquely, and almost comically as a tool of policy. And not just lying once, but lying again and 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 again until you've battered people with lies so hard that either they believe what they're being told, they accept that this leader's going to do whatever they want because they just don't want to hear another word of it, or they think there's no smoke without fire. It's a story of medieval fake news, of information wars. And although this book is not, and this talk, I promise you, has not been a sort of meta attack on the 45th President of the United States, I think more than any book and any story from the Middle Ages that I've worked on before, the story of the Templars is more than just an exciting kind of romp through battlefields of the Middle Ages and the Middle East, although I promise you it is. It's not just a story that's about 800, 700 years ago. It's a story that is about today and maybe even a little bit about tomorrow. Thank you.
We have about 12 minutes during which we will take as many questions as we can get through. So if anyone would like to begin with a question, the microphone will come round. There's one over there.
I think it's on.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Yeah. So regarding the battering of lies that the French king did, do you think it is one of the earliest examples of gaslighting somebody or the entire crowd? Just a thought.
Do I think it's one of the earliest examples of gaslighting? Gaslighting be the process where you drive someone mad by the small drip, drip, drip of misinformation and effectively from the play, right? I don't know whether it's one of the first examples, but it's one of the most blatant examples of totally cynical policy by almost absolute falsehood and deception and repetition of lies. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary, and there's voluminous evidence from the trial, the Inquisitions, the various Inquisitions against the Templars individually and the Order collectively, that are just quite astonishing to read. You know, the absolute blatant deployment of torture to achieve exactly the answer to that's required, and then this being rolled up, and probably the most shocking thing, although there are lots of grotesque details about the way in which individual Templars were tortured, the things they were forced to admit, the story of Jacques de Molay being, repeatedly questioned until he'd gone mad, effectively, and was in no state to be presented on trial. One of the sort of most shocking things is at the Council of Vienne in 1312, when the Templars were finally rolled up. The judgment said that because the reputation of the Templars is such, has been so defiled and damaged, and we have to roll them up because no one would want to become a member. Now, the circular logic of that is crazy. Because we've destroyed your reputation, we're going to have to wind you up. I mean, it's kind of, it's totalitarian type thinking.
Dan?
If you've got a microphone, yeah.
Quick question for you. Why did it take the Muslim powers such a long time to wipe out the Crusaders, given the obvious imbalance that was at play at the time?
Why did it take so long for the Muslim powers of Syria and Egypt effectively to wipe out the Crusaders? Well, at the beginning, at the time of the First Crusade, it was widely, the analysis on the Islamic side was the Muslim world is divided, and it absolutely was. You had a decaying Fatimid caliphate in Egypt. You had a Seljuk empire in Syria, in which power was really diffused between lots of individual emirs. States like Damascus and Aleppo and Mosul were much more powerful on the ground than the Seljuk Sultan in Baghdad. In Asia Minor, again, you had the Seljuks of Rum, who again, a different matter. There was great division in the Muslim world. Now, as soon as, firstly, Nur al-Din and then Saladin put together Syria and Egypt under one sultanate, as it becomes under Saladin, then you see, well, firstly, the near destruction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which would probably have been completed had the world not fractured again under Saladin's children after his death. So there's a great difficulty in and part of it is sectarian, it's Sunni Shia divisions, part of it is the sort of rivalry between Cairo and Baghdad. There was enormous problems in uniting the Muslim world. On the two occasions it happened seriously and for a reasonable length of time, under Saladin first of all, and then later under the Mamluks, then the Crusader states are wiped out in pretty short order, because it was, with the benefit of hindsight, obviously, it was barely sustainable to have a Latin kingdom of the East.
What is your favorite topic to write on?
What's my favorite topic to write on? Today it's the Templars, my friend. Look, I've written a lot of books about the Middle Ages, and clearly that's the period I've settled in and I like a great deal. I think it offers an enormous wealth of stories that are somewhat known but not known in detail and can be look, my style of storytelling it tends towards the personal, the epic, and the kind of heroic, I suppose. And there's no shortage of material there. I like long periods of time. I like to write over generations and over centuries. More than anything else, I like good stories. And I like applying story shape and architecture and order to complex subjects. So at the moment, I'm writing another book about the Crusades, which is called Crusaders, which comes out this autumn. I'm just finishing it at the moment, which is rather different from the Templars in that it takes the story and views it from as many sides as possible. So it's not just the sort of French, Western Christian view. It's the view from Byzantium, it's the view from Syria, it's the view from Egypt, it's the view from the Mongols, it's the view of women, it's the view of poets rather than soldiers, So at the moment, what I'm really drawn to is a multiplicity of perspective. But what is a real gift when you're writing this type of book is voices. And if you can tap into the voices of a time, then I think the style of book that I write, it's definitely very useful for the narrative.
Hi, I'd like to ask you about the ways of knowing of a historian. So we've all heard that that history is written by the people who are victorious. And I mean, you were talking about the amount of documentation that was against the Templar Knights and the public displays and basically the false information spreading. So how does the historian of the 21st century, how is the historian of the 21st century able to look past that? What are the tools that we use in order to understand the true story?
So the question is about how you treat your evidence and how you try to find truth amid skewed evidence. I mean, in a sense, that's the historian's job, and it's something that, that Christopher was speaking on very eloquently earlier in the week, and something you probably every historian here will come up against, which is how do you weigh your sources? How do you understand, see past their bias, their purpose, their deficiencies? Ultimately, you can't go back in time. You deal with the source material you have. The key, as far as I can see, is to read as much of it as possible, to immerse yourself in the period, to understand what your limitations are, and to be honest about it, and to say this is as much as we can know. And if you feel like the evidence is deficient to the point where you can't know for sure, then to say so, either in the text itself or in an endnote, so that the reader can know exactly what you as a historian have had to do and come up against. And that's as much as you can do. I do think, however, that, so I suppose to go slightly off topic, that those tools of being a historian, which are weighing up what you're being told and why you're being told it, and trying to come to some sort of reasoned conclusion on the basis of that, are partly they're timeless, but also they're timely. They are very germane to the society in which we live at the moment, in which there is so much freedom of information flow, but also such a sense of information war, that those skills that are developed by historical education are as more valuable than ever.
Could you comment on?
Sorry.
Could you comment on the reason for the First Crusade? Is there a general consensus for it? Is it seen as an act of aggression, or is it seen as a defense for the Muslim invasions of Europe, or as a general power struggle, or an act of, I don't know, just stealing stuff? Is there a consensus of opinion?
No, it would probably be weird if there were a consensus. There are lots of different strands to understanding the First Crusade, and like anything, the historiography rolls and shifts and moves. It depends which perspective you're looking at it from. For a start, there is a great fracture in the Islamic world. That much we know. There had been attacks on Jerusalem early in the 11th century. And there'd been sort of all sorts of scare stories finding their way back to Europe about what terrible things had happened to the Holy Sepulchre and to Christians in the Middle East. And those had some effect, there's no doubt about that. There is, of course, then the Byzantine question, which is that the Byzantium was under attack and was looking for support and went to the West to find it. There is the question about the long-running problems of the papacy and the attempts to assert power over Western Christendom, and the sort of struggles with secular powers, particularly what would become the Holy Roman Empire. There is the sort of the shifts to a kind of knightly society, and the desire to transfer the energies of knights away from smashing up their own territory, smashing up someone else's. I don't think you can pin it down to one dominant reason, and the only way to understand the First Crusade is history as confluence, and the coming together of an incredible number of different kind of movements, different kind of shifts in society, different kind of moments of political history, all at the same time. You know how it feels to live right now? Like we're living through a major technological revolution and particularly weird political moment and economic meltdown. And if you said explain, God, we always say Brexit or Donald Trump. You know what I mean? Explain something big right now. You would be hard-pressed to say it was one thing or the other. It's confluence. It's all of these things coming together. The result itself is nonetheless spectacular.
We have less than a minute left to allow time for thunderous applause. So shall we just take one more question, if we can make it a quick one? Was there one over here?
So I have actually written that.
Are you texting it to me?
No. I have actually written it. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. So my question is basically how far you believe that Templars were decimated because they ultimately posed threats to monarchy and more precisely to the church. Don't you think they were used by the church as non-state actors, and once their role was over, they were systematically silenced?
So to what degree was their fall because of their... Well, I mean, as I said, I think to understand the fall of the Templars, you have to understand, firstly, the crisis of purpose that comes out of 1291 and the retreat of the Crusaders, what's left of the Crusader states to Cyprus, and what that means in terms of ever wanting to go back to Jerusalem. Now it's not just a case of defending territory and hoping to creep further on towards Jerusalem. It's actually, what you would now need was another full-blown First Crusade, or a full seaborne landing onto the Syrian and Palestinian mainland. For the Templars themselves, they understandably, for the 15 years after the fall of Acre in 1291, cop a lot of blame for A, having lost the Crusader states, and B, having not won them back yet. So I think there's that element to it. I think, for me, a big part of it is the particular problems of the King of France and his desire, firstly his financial problems and his desire to prove himself the most Christian monarch, the most Christian king. And the Templars get caught in the middle of this much larger struggle between French kings and popes, which lots of people have looked back on the era and seen the fall of the Templars as a turning point in Western history. But it's a huge subject, and I'm also being told time's run out. So.
Our time is against us. There are a million more questions. Buy the book, and you will get the answers. I promised you a tale of high society, money, betrayal, love, death, murder.
Thank you all. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Thank you.